Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since I had any Dreams tutorials, but there was some interest on Twitter about a little clip I made of procedural terrain generation. So I thought it was probably easy enough to put together a little talk through of the major elements that make it work. And I'm still not 100% convinced that this is the only way to do it. It's the best way that I've had so far that gives you enough to maybe feel like there's a game in it. I've tried some other things over the last year or so. This is my favorite so far, so I'll talk you through it, and then maybe we can open up a bit of a discussion about if there's a more, especially gameplay thermo conservative way to pull it off. Okay, so if you have a look here, I've just set up some key sculpts ahead of time. There's 3 spheres there. They're pathfinders for creating noise in the terrain, and we'll add the logic to that as we go. There's the base terrain sculpt. Now you see it's quite deep, rocky and deep. And if you have a look, I can pump down the looseness. That's just a bunch of hexagons that are... I use looseness quite a lot to get away with dodgy sculpting. Great technique. But yeah, it's just a nice kind of bunch of messy hexagons to give it an organic shape. The top part's a bit important that it has a little bit of a slopiness so that you can end up with slopes, and the way I've created a bit of the slope is by cutting off the top of a squashed cone. So if you do a little cone shape here, in the default it's quite tall, so you just stretch it down and then you cut off the top of it. There's a couple of different ways you can do it, and the more overlap and the more slopiness, the better. It's one of the elements of this that you can play around with to get a better effect. But what that's going to do is give you a little malleable base terrain unit. Here's a little bit of water. It's nothing special at all. Just got some effects on it to make it look a bit like water. It's certainly not high level stuff. No transparency or anything. It's just a flat sculpt we can drag out. And a big microchip in the middle that's going to control some of the base logic when we get around to it. That square one as well is a little spawner kind of thing that is going to be used to spawn these pathfinders. So we'll get to the Pathfinder logic now. I'm going to do one first because much of it can be replicated. You're going to need a few things on this Pathfinder. What I start with, I think, is a way to destroy it, because you don't want to end up with these things running around forever. And they're going to destroy on a signal called go, and go is our big signal. Go is like, let's start building the terrain, and at that point the Pathfinder, which generates a map of noise on the landscape, is done for. So we can destroy those when the go signal comes. Okay, this timer we're going to set up is kind of the, I guess, beating heart of the noise system. If that heart were to beat at 100 times a second almost. No, 10 times a second. It's a really fast flickering trigger zone. And the reason for the flicker is that the noise map requires counters on each of our terrain cells. And to keep incrementally ticking the counter up to decide how high that piece of land will go, we need a little repeating timer that's just going to keep cycling over and over and over, and only very, very briefly pulse on the sensor, so that we get this kind of flickering effect, and we should see how that works out pretty soon. Literally just set to 0.1 second as low as it goes for a fast flicker. We're going to hook up the finished signal to a NOT gate So when it's not finished, as in when it's running, it will not be on. And then if you see here, it flickers. It doesn't actually show the flicker on the circle there. But that flickering activity on the trigger zone is really super important. The last thing we need is the mover, a way to move this Pathfinder around. If you saw any of my other tutorials, you'll know how this works. It's pretty much the same thing. It uses two signal generators to move the X and Z axis on an advanced mover. There's a couple of things that you have to do alongside that, but if you just watch, the variables can be changed, and that's what I love about this system and these kind of signal generators, is they're so variable. You can change all this stuff to get a different noise pattern. You know, it'll move the Pathfinder in different ways to create a different effect. I've set the sweep seconds to 0.7. Pause time range, I think you don't even need anything. I don't like having much of a pause time range on these, although for another part of it we might need to in a second. And the range is essentially going to be -5 to 5, and that's going to impact the speed at which these move around. And again, change the speed, you change the noise map, and change the terrain generation effect. So, as I said, X and Z. We don't want any Y movement or they'll fly off into the sky. It's also really important that you set the sculpt itself to movable, of course, so it moves, and also ignore gravity so it doesn't just fall down. So I'll do that now. And theoretically, we should be able to test it out quickly and see how it goes. Off you go there. That way. Now these, they're tending to start moving in the same way, and I think the reason for that is the phase offset. I have a feeling that the phase offset impacts the randomness at the very start, whereas if you set the phase offset fully, it's going to move around a bit differently. I'll just replicate that rather than redo the physics settings and stuff. Yeah, here we go. Try that again. Yeah, get all of it. Okay, we're pretty happy with that for now. Now we're going to change the next one. This is going to be slightly different. We're going to change the... Yeah, we want these to match. Okay, this one's going to have a much bigger pause time range, and that's because this is going to be the rivers. Now, with a bigger pause time range, it will stay in the axis that the first signal gives it for longer, so it's going to give long stretches. It's basically going to do straight lines at this way. It's also going to go much faster because we don't need it to slowly kind of meander around. We just want it to shoot off in a direction to create a river. I think in retrospect, if you change the sweep seconds, it can give a nice curve. So play around with the sweep seconds and the pause time range, maybe a lower pause time range and bigger sweep seconds if you want your rivers to curve. Yeah, here's the phase offset. I think if I set these higher, they're going to be more random at the start. It just seems to work that way. Alright, as we can see, that one there is bouncing off straight, long and straight, being more like a river or a road you could perhaps use it to create. Last one, it's actually going to be the hill tag as well. So the 3 tags, 2 of them will say hill, one of them will say river. So this one's the river, and it needs to have a different name. It has to be looking for the river tag because it does a very different thing. But the 2 of them can be called hill. And the biggest difference is this is going to be a wider, so it's got a bigger, like 20 meter radius zone size, and it's going to flicker much more slowly. And what this will do, the first hill Pathfinder is going to make these little like lumpy hills, and this one is going to make big, wide, rolling, flat hills. It's just going to flicker slowly, very slowly, add a few little notches to the height map. And it's going to add diverse terrain. Theoretically, you could add quite a few different kinds. You could probably figure out a way to add negative movement to your terrain bases, so you've got like even more three-dimensional kind of shaping. There's a lot of ways you could use this system. So there are 3 Pathfinders. Easy. Now, what has to happen with these is they have to be emitted somehow. We want them to be emitted kind of randomly across the landscape, so that they're not all our terrain map isn't always starting from, hills in the same spaces. And that's what this little square block is for. So we also want to destroy this, but this one's a little less... it can hang around for a bit longer, so I think we just put a 10-second timer. Destroy it after 10 seconds. All of these elements, by the way, can be just set to invisible, which is fine. But the idea is you'd probably hide this anyway with like a UI screen, and you want to have them destroyed before the player would start playing on the map. But yeah, so we got a 10-second timer there. It's going to destroy this. So Pathfinders are going to blow up when it's go time. And this is going to destroy itself after 10 seconds. Now, here's a bit of the random logic. Randomizers are good for a few things here. Signal generators are better for random noise generally. But if you just want, kind of probability, it's good to use randomizers. So we're going to emit these 3 Pathfinders, basically. So the emitters are randomly going to shoot out once, and a maximum of however many. I don't think if you're going to emit once, I don't think that makes a difference. But it's just set to once, and all 3 of those Pathfinders are going to be hooked up to one of these emitters on the little spawner object that we've created here. So that one's going to happen 1 in every 10 squares. That one's going to happen 1 in every 10 squares. They're our 2 hill kind of creators. And the rivers we want to be much less frequent. So you're basically doing 1 in 10 times 1 in 10, which is hooking it up to 2 randomizers. So basically 1 in 100 chance of creating a river. Which means you might get maybe 0 to 3 in any given map generally of river spawn points. Okay, so I think the first time, maybe I'm doing this wrong. We definitely need that last one to be the rivers, and I think I hooked it up to the second hill Pathfinder. So yeah, that middle one's the river. See, we check the tag here, river. So that one has to be hooked up to the last emitter, which will occur, 10 times in every 10 times, so 1 in 100 times. The others are 1 in 10, so they're going to be more frequent. Okay. So basically, that thing's set up, and now we need a way to create that. We could just duplicate them with everyone, but even then I think it's too frequent. So don't mind me while I try and figure out what's wrong with the emitter. I think it was just bad luck. I was testing out the randomness. I think it's just bad luck. Yeah, there we go. That one emitted one. Okay, so we're not going to worry about that. Now, we're going to emit this little spawner box once every 5 times with a little bit more logic on the terrain itself. Now, you could argue that you don't need this extra step of having the emitter. You could directly emit those spawners from the terrain. But for some reason I felt that maybe limiting, and I might be wrong on this, limiting the amount of logic on the piece of equipment that you're going to replicate the most, which is the base terrain, it was better to kind of outsource some of that logic to something that's not always spawned. I'm happy to test that. I want to test it more and discuss it. So if you think it's an irrelevant step, you may be right. But basically 1 in every 5 times we're going to create the spawner object. So it's actually, maybe my maths is a bit wrong, but anyway, it works out okay. Trust me, you watch, with these numbers it works out okay generally. We want to destroy the land occasionally, and that's when the river comes along. Basically what happens is we've just got this kind of water underneath, and if this terrain is destroyed, it will reveal the river underneath, create a nice little path. So that's a really simple way of creating a river system, by having the long kind of shooty pathfinders just delete a row of them. Okay, so if we get kind of a roll of 1 on a 5D, I guess, we're going to create the little spawner box, which will then occasionally create stuff on our map. Pathfinders. Again, you just want to emit once, and you don't want any speed on it, no time between emits. Should be fine. The most important thing of this terrain module is a mover. Now, basically, this gives us the height map, and this is where the counter comes in. So we're going to, when it's go time, when all our maps been drawn, and we'll have a demo of how the drawing works in a second, the signal in our central microchip is going to say go, and the mover is going to turn on. And it's going to turn on at a speed dictated by the counter, which has been affected by the flickering sensor zone on the Pathfinder that runs around the place. Hopefully that makes sense, but it makes probably more sense when you see it in action. So I'm going to have to add the counter now. Counter is really useful for a lot of things, not quite as useful as some of the other things. I kind of only rarely find myself using them compared to variables, etc. But for this case, it's absolutely perfect. So we're going to hook up to a tag called hill. So whenever a hill sensor is turned on, that's going to increment by 1. And if we just stuck it directly like that, it's not going to do much. The speed doesn't translate very well. And you can play around with your modulation and your direct overwrite and things like that, but it's still going to be too slow. So we need calculators to modify the count output. And in this case, I set it to times 1,000. Just straight up multiply that by 1,000 and move it at that speed. Move it upward at the speed of 1,000 times whatever the counter says on this particular block of land. Now, we'll see how that works out. Maybe you can guess at how that's going to affect the terrain generation. We'll have a look at it in a minute when everything else is finished. We also want to make sure that the mover is pointing directly up. Not in local space necessarily, but just straight up on the y-axis, so that when that mover starts working, it just pushes it upwards a set amount. And how we stop the movement is just a timer, and that's another variable you can alter. Now I'm going to use the counter again as well, and this is a little kind of bonus. And for me, it changes the look of the land a little bit. maybe you could argue it gives it a kind of snowy effect on the peaks. But mostly it's just to visualize the noise that's generated. We're going to times by 25 that count output, and we're going to stick it on the tint amount. So it's basic of the grass. That's directly on the grass. So we open up the properties of the grass and change the tint amount. And essentially when the pathfinders go overhead, they're going to tick off the counter. The counter's going to affect the speed at which it rises and also the color. So we can see and visualize the map of noise. Now, finally, we're actually pretty close. We're up to the final stage, which is just the central controls. Basically the timing logic for when this stuff all happens. The first time are basically telling us how long our pathfinders are going to run for. We can change this, and it has, again, some effect on the nature of the noise pattern. Lots of variables to play with. So we're just going to send it directly into a whole scene. It has to select the whole scene wireless receiver called Go. And we need a signal coming into Go. This is something I always forget on my receivers and transmitters, is you do need a signal in, otherwise even if it turns on it's not going to do anything. So I'm just going to feed a signal in that says my time is finished, which it will be whenever this runs. But I can't just turn it on, because otherwise Go will keep going, and I don't want Go to keep going. I want Go to stop. Go is a limited time, because when Go stops, the hills need to stop rising. So I've set my second timer at 0.3 seconds. So Go will last for 0.3 seconds. Then our movement will stop, and we'll have a nice little map of varying sized hills, etc. So we want Go only to occur when our first timer is finished. So 7.5 seconds is finished, but 7.5 seconds plus 0.3 seconds is not finished. So it's just going to run for the interim. And the first timer starts when the second one stops. So as you can see there, we've got no Go. This is going to go around, it's going to go around, and then very quickly, boom, it's going to be on and then off again immediately. Just for that very brief period of time, we're going to have movement. And because the speeds are so variable in that second, hopefully we're going to see a nice little map. That's literally all the logic. That's all the logic. And I know it might seem a lot, or it might seem not much, depending on how much you're used to working with logic. But it's a pretty simple solution at the end of the day. So we can test it out now. I'm just going to clone these across. This is what you have to do. And this is why limiting the logic on these is kind of important. Because you do need to replicate. And the more you can replicate this, the bigger the map you can create. So it's really important. And we haven't played with trees or rocks or objects, characters. We haven't really added anything else to this yet. So you need gameplay thermo to work with. So it's quite important when you're replicating these to make groups at the start, like that long group of 9. Because, here we go. It just makes it easier to delete, rather than deleting them one by one when you realize you made a mistake. Whoa, okay. So, anyone figure out the problem? It looks kind of cool. It's working. It's mostly working. We don't have any rivers, it seems. But maybe that's just a one-off. But they're moving too fast. So the map is going too crazy high. That's an easy fix, and if you can figure it out, we'll show you in a sec. Think about where the easiest way to fix that is. There's a few potential ways you could fix that, but there's a very easy one. So yeah, I'm not getting any rivers, unfortunately, and it looks like there are some river pathfinders moving around. I think I spotted one. But for whatever reason, it's not destroying the landscape. So we're going to investigate that. just a couple of bits of troubleshooting. It was almost perfect, but there's 2 changes we need to make. One is to move that calculation down by a factor of 10, and we'll see how we go. So rather than 1,000 times the counter, we're going to go 100 times the counter. And also, so our tag that was meant to destroy these blocks wasn't named. We forgot to give it a name of river. You might have spotted that when it happened. So they weren't being destroyed. And I think that's pretty much the only issue. So we can have a play around and drag the rivers out, the water out now. If we can, just stretch this big old flat cell out. Pancake. Now, obviously, there's 1,000 ways you can mess... The sculpts themselves, what it looks like, completely arbitrary. You know, I played around with this last night after I first kind of worked on it over the weekend and and I made it like neon cubes, and it's like this synthwave setup. It's really cool. I might publish it a bit later as well. So there's a million ways you can make the water look different. And especially those terrain blocks you can style and play with and improve. This one's a bit different to the one I put on Twitter, and it's a little more cartoony maybe. Might fit a certain style better than mine, or might... You know, I've just done it for the tutorial as simply as possible. Alright, so let's just redo this. Create a big old map. If we have a look, it doesn't take up too much thermo. What I've created there, if you look at the thermo, I think it's only like 20%. So you still got a lot to work with. Theoretically, you could make a map 5 times as big. Here we go. That looks alright. Don't have a river yet, but I think that's just bad luck. We can tweak the variables if we want rivers to come up all the time. Here we go. That one looks kind of cool. A little hill there. You can definitely make this much bigger. I usually do something like 27 by 27 maybe. Leaves me about 15% gameplay to play with. Ah, there's a river. Hooray. 27 by 27 grid has been working out for me when I've been playing. This is smaller than that. It's just for demo purposes. There we go. Can add a character in if we want and see how it feels to play. And it is what I like about this. Not only does it leave us enough thermo, it's a nice little self-contained space, and it's quite playable in that the slopes you can just walk across oftentimes, although it's quite addictive to jump with the little fella. And the way you sculpt the top of these things as well. Here we go, we can pop him in. Maybe get a boost when the hills grow. Whee! It didn't work so well. Yeah, so the way you create these little things can really alter the feel of... And you could have gentle rolling slopes like sand dunes, all of one colour. You don't need to make it in the little kind of dirt pattern and rocks here. You can play around and see what works for you. But it looks kind of cool, and you can make a little platformer even. You could randomly spawn some coins in to have like a procedurally generated platformer. Yeah, it doesn't look too bad. Some rivers are being created. Not sure what happened to that one little... Yeah, and I'm only on 20% gameplay memory for that, which is really quite... Considering all the logic we got replicated across, you know, a quite dense grid of squares, that's pretty good. And it suggests you can make it quite a bit bigger, and we may still have some really significant improvements. I would love a way where the terrain is just emitted, it's just a block that's just emitted, but I've tried. It hasn't worked so far. I'm going to show you what the other one I made. This took quite a bit more time in terms of tweaking the style, and you can see I've put it in a nice little well-lit skybox sort of thing. It's got nice, longer, wavy grass, and also I think I worked a bit longer on the slopiness of that sculpt. Another thing I did with this one is that I twisted all, like in a little cube shaped set of clones, I twisted some of the grid tiles around so that it wasn't quite so repetitive in nature. But if you look at that, it looks like a beautiful hill. So yeah, I think that's about it. If you've got any questions at all, let me know. If you've got improvements, I love to hear them. I learned so much from the improvements other dreamers have made after my other tutorials. So, yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I'll see you again soon. Check it out. There's a link in the description to the dream itself. I've made it remixable and shared it to you with a couple of extra tweaks you might be able to have a look at. See you soon.